Welcome back to Nature Documentary for Sleep. If you enjoy these quiet expeditions, leave a comment and consider liking and subscribing. Tonight, you're standing on the South Rim, watching the Grand Canyon pretend it's finished. The air is cold enough to feel heavy, pooling in the dark space where the sunlight hasn't arrived yet. From up here, the layers look like a museum display, neat and motionless. The kind of silence people trust. But the stillness is a misunderstanding, because rock keeps cracking, slopes keep creeping, and gravity never clocks out. You can't see the Colorado River from the rim, but you can feel the logic of it, pulling everything downhill. So you stop admiring the walls and start following the maker, a thin ribbon of water with an unreasonable job. As you descend, the question narrows to mechanics: how base level, slope, sediment, and bedrock strength let incision outpace collapse. And if the river can only cut as fast as its gradient and tools allow, what exactly changed in that profile to start the deepening? You take your first steps away from the railing, and the rim wind immediately changes its tone. It stops being a breeze and becomes a hand on your shoulder, guiding you toward the drop. The trail under your boots is pale dust over bedrock, and the dust wants to leave. It tries to roll, one grain at a time, toward the unseen channel that started all this. You think the canyon is a hole, a wound, something removed, but you are walking on the leftovers, the exports, the evidence of a long demolition. A pebble twitches near your toe, and you watch it hesitate, then commit. It clicks twice and disappears downslope, already joining the canyon's workforce. That is your first escalation, small and quiet, but it is the whole plot. Everything here is either falling, sliding, dissolving, or being carried away. You keep descending, and the rim's neat layer cake starts to misbehave. The wall develops seams, joints, and fractures that look like someone folded stone like paper. You run your glove over a crack, and it feels like a zipper that never closes. Water got in here once, then froze, then expanded, and the rock remembered. The canyon is not carved only by the river. It is also opened by winter, by gravity, by time, by the simple fact that cliffs cannot hold a pose forever. A faint tapping carries upward, not a voice, not an animal, just stone. Somewhere below you, a block shifted in a slow slump, and the canyon sighed. You expected a grand descent, a heroic route into the depths. Instead, it feels like entering a construction site after hours, with nobody present, but work still happening. You keep your eyes on the trail, because loose gravel has a sense of humor. It waits until you trust it, then it turns into marbles. You could stop here, stay at the rim with the safe illusion. People do that every day, take the photo, eat the sandwich, leave the canyon unchanged. But you have a different assignment tonight. You are going to audit the river, to watch how a narrow current earned the right to cut this deep. As the sun begins to thin the darkness, the walls warm by degrees, like an engine idling. The air dries as you drop, and your lips notice before your eyes do. The scent changes too, from pine and frost to mineral dust and baked stone. A raven drifts below you, using rising air like an escalator. It looks effortless, which is rude considering what your calves are doing. You round a switchback, and the first real cliff band appears, a clean face of limestone. It is light-colored, almost polite, like it belongs in a courthouse. But beneath that, darker layers peek out, weaker ones, the ones that do not stand tall. They crumble into slopes, and those slopes are the canyon's secret widening machine. Hard layers make cliffs, soft layers make ramps, and the ramps make room for failure. You can read it like a bad sandwich. Strong crust on top, slippery filling underneath, and gravity biting down from above. A small spring leaks from a seam in the rock, barely enough to wet a palm, but it leaves a green stain, a thin line of life clinging to the fracture. That seep is not scenic decoration. It is a wedge, a lubricant, a warning that water is still negotiating with stone. And wherever water can enter, it can also weaken. One molecule at a time. You pass a pile of talus, broken blocks at the base of a cliff. Each block is a sentence in the canyon's diary, saying, "I used to be higher. Some fell yesterday, some fell 10,000 years ago." But the pile does not care. It is all just inventory waiting to be moved again. You kneel and pick up a shard, and it is cold. Even in warming air, the rock holds night longer than your skin does. You set it down, and it fits into the pile like it always belonged there. That is the canyon's comfort, if you want one. Nothing is lost. It is only relocated, broken down. Shipped out, the trail bends toward a narrow side drainage. A dry wash that looks asleep, but you notice the small boulders jammed high in its banks like teeth marks. This wash has flooded violently, and not that long ago. The desert does this, waits quietly, then tries to erase its own patience. In one afternoon, those flash floods matter because they deliver the river's tools. Sand to grind, cobbles to hammer, silt to carry away the evidence. Without tools, a river is just water, sliding over stone and accomplishing very little. With tools, it becomes a belt sander with no off switch. You stand and keep moving because the canyon is not interested in your analysis. It wants you lower. As you drop, you start to feel the canyon's temperature gradient like a slow exhale. The rim was a cold room. Down here, it becomes a dry hallway, and you can tell there is a warmer basement below. Your ears pop slightly, not from pressure like an airplane, but from the way the air settles. Sound changes too. At the rim, wind dominates, constant and unbothered. Lower down, the wind gets trapped and redirected, turning into short gusts that arrive late. You pause at an overlook where the trail crosses a ledge. The view opens, and the canyon's scale tries to overwhelm your brain again. You see terraces, temples, and buttes, names humans gave to rock because we cannot stand neutral shapes. But you force yourself to look for movement instead of grandeur. You scan for fresh scars, pale patches where rock recently broke free. You find them, small at first, then everywhere. The canyon is freckled with new rubble, constantly retouching its own walls. If you listen, you might catch a tiny clatter somewhere far below. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just one more pebble choosing gravity. And that clatter, multiplied by millions of years, is how a canyon stays wide while a river stays narrow. You continue downward and the trail crosses from one layer to another. The footing changes abruptly, from firm ledge to crumbly slope. Your boots slide a half step, and you catch yourself. Congratulations, you just met a weaker unit, the kind that collapses into dust. This is where the canyon cheats. The river cuts down? Yes, but the walls also give up wherever the rock is soft. That surrender is what makes the famous profile, the stair steps, the alternating cliffs and slopes. It is not design, it is differential resistance. Geology's way of saying some rocks try harder than others. You pick your way across the loose section and you start thinking about the river again. Because none of this widening happens without a trigger. The slopes fail faster when the river lowers the floor, undercut the base, and the whole wall has to renegotiate its angle. You are not just walking downhill. You are following a cause and effect chain that begins with water finding a lower route to sea level. That is what base level really is, in human terms. It is the river's idea of done, the lowest place it can realistically reach given the world's shape at the time. If that lowest place drops, the river panics, and it starts cutting to catch up. If it rises, the river relaxes, and it starts depositing instead. So the canyon's question becomes sharper. When did the river's definition of done change? And how fast did the news travel upstream? You take another turn, and now the rock around you is older, darker, and less friendly. The limestone fades, replaced by bands that look more like compacted mud. Shale, siltstone, layers that were once soft sediment on an ancient seafloor. They weather into slopes that crumble under a fingernail. These are failure plains, the lubricated pages in the canyon's book. Rain hits them and they turn slick. Then gravity does what it always does. You see a slump scar nearby, a curved head wall where a whole slice of hillside rotated and slid. It looks like the land tried to sit down and missed the chair. That slump probably moved inches at a time during wet seasons, then stopped, then moved again. Slow motion disaster, the kind humans barely notice until the trail disappears. You step carefully because you are not immune to the physics. And now, finally, a new sound arrives, faint and constant. At first, you think it is wind threading through rock, but it has a steadier rhythm than wind, a low, continuous hush like distant traffic that never gets closer. It is the Colorado, still hidden by folds and walls, but announcing itself anyway. A small sound with a large job. You follow it, and the trail steepens as if the canyon is tired of your pace. The switchbacks tighten, and your knees start to notice. You step down from ledge to ledge, and you begin to smell the river before you see it. Not a pleasant smell, not flowers, just damp minerals, wet stone, and something faintly metallic. You round a final bend, and the inner gorge opens like a throat. The rock turns darker, harder, more ancient. The walls lose their tidy layers and become twisted, shiny in places, like they were kneaded. This is basement rock, the deep crust that was already old when the upper layers were still ocean mud. And down at the bottom of this chasm, the river finally shows itself. Not wide, not blue, often not even pretty. It is coffee brown, opaque, moving with a steady urgency that feels almost rude. It looks like it should be carving a ditch, not a masterpiece. And yet, here you are, standing in a wound big enough to have weather of its own. The underwhelming appearance is the second escalation, because now you have to accept a harder truth. The river does not need to be enormous to be effective. It needs power at the bed, and it needs tools in the flow. You step closer to the bank, where sand is piled in damp bars. You pinch a little between your fingers, and it stains your skin. This sand has traveled, ground down from mountains, carried in bursts, dropped in calmer water. And when the river is high, this same sand becomes a grinding paste. It bounces, rolls, and scours the channel bottom. Abrasive erosion, simple as that, like sandpaper dragged across wood. But there is also impact, cobble and gravel placking along the bed, battering weak spots. And there is plucking, where water pressure in cracks lifts blocks free. The river does not just sand the canyon, it also pries it apart, exploiting every fracture the plateau offers. You watch the current wrap around a boulder, creating a small standing wave. Behind it is an eddy, a lazy swirl where sediment settles. In front of it, the flow accelerates, tight and focused. That contrast matters. Erosion is not evenly distributed. It happens where flow is fastest, where turbulence drives particles into rock, where the bed is exposed and vulnerable. Outside bends, constrictions, places where the river is forced to concentrate its frustration. You crouch and look at the waterline on a rock, a dark stain a little above the current. It marks a recent higher stage, not a biblical flood, just a reminder that the river has moods. Most days it mutters past, doing minor work. Some days it arrives swollen, loud, carrying debris like a convoy. And on those days, incision can happen in minutes what would otherwise take years. This is the third escalation, and it changes your sense of time. The canyon was not carved by steady flow alone. It was carved by pulses, by rare events that do disproportionate work. The river is a patient laborer with occasional violent overtime. You pick up a rounded pebble from the bank, and it fits your palm perfectly. It is smooth, no sharp corners left. That smoothness is not gentleness. It is repeated impact, collisions, rolling abrasion, a long commute through rock. You toss it lightly back onto the bar, and it lands without a sound. But in high water, that same pebble would be a bullet ricocheting along the bed. Now you start to test a new idea, because the river demands it. If incision depends on tools, then too few tools makes the river toothless. But too many tools can also be a problem. A thick blanket of coarse gravel can armor the bed, protecting it from further cutting. So the river needs an awkward balance, enough sediment to abrade, not so much that it shields the rock, just enough chaos, delivered at the right times, in the right grain sizes. You stand and look downstream, where the river narrows between dark walls. The current speeds up, and the surface becomes rougher. A rapid, not huge, but energetic. Here the river spends more of its energy on turbulence and collisions. Stream power is the term, but in human language, it is simply work capacity. How much force the river can apply to its bed and banks. That force depends on discharge and slope, how much water, and how steep the drop. The slope is the canyon's quiet secret. If you want a river to cut deep, you either give it more water or you give it more drop. Or you do both sometimes when the climate cooperates. But the drop is controlled by base level, and base level is controlled by the world downstream, which means the canyon's deepest cause might not be here at all. It might be far away in the level the river is trying to reach. You take a slow walk along the bank, watching the river handle its load. Finer sediment stays suspended, turning the water opaque. Coarser pieces bump along the bottom, occasionally surfacing in shallow riffles. You can hear it sometimes, a faint clink beneath the water, stones talking to each other. That sound is erosion in progress, not dramatic, just persistent. You look up at the walls again, and the scale feels different now. You are no longer admiring the canyon as a thing. You are watching it as a negotiation between energy and resistance, between a river's need to lose elevation and a plateau's insistence on being solid. This is where you reach your first clear decision point. You can stay here at the river, hypnotized by current and noise, or you can step back mentally and follow the logic upstream and downstream. Because a river does not explain itself fully in one reach. Its cutting power is set by the whole system, the entire profile from headwaters to outlet. So you let the river keep talking, and you start listening for what it cannot say out loud. It cannot tell you where it began. It cannot tell you where it ends, but it can tell you what it wants by the way it behaves. It wants a lower finish line. It wants a steeper path to get there, and it wants enough grit in its mouth to chew. You stand close enough to feel cool mist on your shins. The water looks thick, like melted stone, and in a way, it is. Most of what you call river is just borrowed mountain. It is rock resized. It is rock made portable. And right now, it is trying to make more. You look at the channel floor and you imagine it not as a place, but as a number, not a map number, a psychological number. How low the river thinks it is supposed to be. If the river is too high compared to that expectation, it starts behaving like this. It narrows, it accelerates. It trades peace for efficiency. It stops meandering and starts committing. So the next move is not deeper into the gorge. The next move is backward in time and sideways across the plateau, because you are standing inside a sentence that began long before the words you can see. You find a flat rock and sit, letting your breathing match the current. Your knees hum with the memory of the descent. The canyon walls trap heat, and you can feel the air thickening by the minute. This is what the river lives in, this warm slot, this echoing hallway. But the river did not always have this hallway. It had to earn it, and the first thing it needed was something to cut. That sounds obvious, but it is the whole trick. A river cannot carve a canyon into nothing. It needs a surface that has already been laid down. And the surface above you, the pretty staircase of layers, was not made for you. It was made by oceans that do not exist anymore. It was made by dunes that forgot how to move. It was made by mud that got buried and gave up. You close your eyes and you climb without moving. You let the walls become a calendar. You let each band of rock become a season that lasted too long. Above the inner gorge, the cliff faces turn more orderly again. They stack like pages. Some are hard, stubborn, cliff-making layers. Some are soft, slope-making layers. And each one formed near sea level, which is the part that should bother you. You are not near sea level right now. Your lungs already know that. The air up at the rim was thin enough to make you sip it. Yet these rocks were born in shallow water, under waves, under sunlight filtered through a warm ancient sea, meaning the land moved. Not a little, not dramatically, like a movie earthquake. Slowly, broadly, unfairly, like someone raising the floor while you are trying to sleep. You start to picture the Colorado Plateau as a table, a big table, thick, heavy, meant to hold weight. Now picture someone lifting one end of that table, just a little, over and over, for millions of years. Everything on top of it slides. Everything on top of it has to adjust. And a river is the first thing to complain. Because a river is just gravity with a water budget. You open your eyes and look up at the walls again. The topmost pale band, the one people love because it looks clean and official, is limestone. Kaibab limestone, a name that sounds like it should come with a park brochure. It formed in a warm, shallow sea, where shells accumulated, where lime mud settled, where life died and became structure. You can almost smell salt if you try hard enough. But the scent you get is dust and river damp. That mismatch is the Plateau's confession. This place was assembled elsewhere, under different rules, then lifted into this dry, cold air. You stand and start walking along the bank, stepping around driftwood jammed between stones. Driftwood in a desert canyon is always a little insulting. It is proof of faraway forests, proof of water that traveled, proof of floods big enough to steal trees. You touch one branch, it is sun-bleached, cracked, light as bone. It came from high country you cannot see from here. It took years to get here and one afternoon to arrive. That is how the river likes to work. Slow planning, sudden execution. You let your mind rise through the layers again. Below the Kaibab is another limestone, the Toroweep, less famous, more complicated. It has gypsum in places, evaporite minerals left behind when seawater dried in restricted basins. Human translation, this rock remembers a sea that got trapped and boiled away. Then come the red sandstones and siltstones, the Supai group, bands of rust and maroon. They formed in coastal plains and shallow marine settings, alternating between wet and dry, like a shoreline that could not decide. Then the Coconino sandstone, pale and cross-bedded, frozen dunes. Dunes so old they became cliffs. You can still see the angled stripes, the slip faces, the way wind once pushed sand uphill. Above you, those dunes are now a ceiling that holds up hikers and gift shops. Congratulations, you are standing on a fossilized desert. Below that is the Hermit Shale, softer, darker, a slope maker, a layer that turns to crumbs when it gets wet. Then the Supai again, then the Redwall limestone, which is actually gray but stained red by everything above it bleeding iron. The canyon even lies about its colors. Below that, the Muav limestone and the Bright Angel Shale. More sea, more mud, more quiet deposition. And then the Tepats sandstone. The beach, that is the feeling you should hold on to. The Tepats is a shoreline turned to stone, sand compacted, cemented, hardened. It is the place where waves once broke. Now it is a ledge high above a river that did not exist yet. That is the absurdity you have to accept. The canyon is not just cut. It is cut into a stack of environments that never belonged together in one vertical column. Only burial and uplift made them neighbors. You stop walking and listen to the river again. It does not care about your naming system. It cares about gradient. And the gradient is not just a local slope here in the gorge. It is the difference between where the river is and where it is allowed to go. So you follow the chain further back. You picture the Colorado Plateau before it was high. Not a canyon country postcard, more like a broad, low region, closer to sea level, with rivers that wandered and deposited, not rivers that cut trenches. You picture water spreading out, making wide valleys, making floodplains, building terraces instead of demolishing them. The rocks were still there, stacked, but they were not exposed like this. They were buried under more sediment, under younger layers, under time that has since been peeled away. And then the plateau rose, not like a mountain range, not crumpled into peaks, more like a thick slab being nudged upward, broad and coherent, lifted without being shattered. That style matters, because if you lift a slab evenly, you do not create one big mountain chain. You create a high, flat region. You create a plateau. And a plateau is a trap for water until it is not. You try to imagine the forces under your feet, not mystical forces, just the earth doing its slow interior chores. The crust here thickened in ancient times, then cooled. Heat moved around beneath it. The mantle flowed, sluggish like very hot putty. Somewhere, lithosphere was modified, thinned, or warmed enough to become buoyant. Or the crust itself became lighter by losing dense roots. There are a few competing details depending on which scientist you invite to dinner, but the result is the same. The plateau rose. It rose without asking the rivers for permission, and the rivers responded by seeking new exits, because that is all they can do. They cannot climb. They cannot negotiate. They can only cut or relocate. When you lift land, you increase potential energy. Human translation, you give water more reason to hurry. A river on a flat, low plain has time to wander. A river on a rising plateau starts to feel behind schedule, so it begins to focus. It starts to dig downward to keep pace with uplift. This is the key tension you will carry with you. Uplift is the hand raising the table. Incision is the knife cutting down into it. If the hand lifts faster, the knife angle changes. If the table rises, the river steepens. If the river steepens, it gains stream power. If it gains stream power, it can cut deeper, assuming it has tools. And if it cuts deeper, the walls oversteepen and gravity starts throwing pieces down to help. It becomes a system, not a single cause. You kneel near the edge of the water and watch sand grains swirl in a small eddy. They move in circles, patient, like they are waiting for a promotion. During a flood, they will get it. They will be reassigned to the main current, to the cutting face, to the violent part of the job. You stand again, and your eyes trace the canyon upward. You notice something that feels like a quiet insult. All those layers, all those ancient seas and deserts are sitting high in the air, yet the river is only one thread at the bottom. It should not be able to win this argument, unless the rules changed, unless something happened downstream that gave the river a reason to cut and the ability to keep cutting. That is where base level comes back in. Base level is the minimum elevation the river can reach at its outlet. If the outlet drops, the river has to follow. It does not have a choice. It sends a signal upstream, not as a message, but as a change in slope. A nick point forms, a step in the river profile, like a wrinkle in a carpet being pushed across a room. That step migrates upstream over time, carving as it goes. Everything behind it becomes lower, steeper, and locked into incision mode. Everything ahead of it remains higher, gentler, still living in the before times. You can picture it now, a river that once rolled through broad valleys, then suddenly faced a lower finish line far away. It did not instantly become a canyon cutter everywhere. The change traveled. It moved upstream, reach by reach, like news spreading through a slow bureaucracy. And when the news arrived, the landscape had to comply. You step away from the water onto cobbles that shift under your weight. Each stone is rounded, river polished. It is hard to keep footing, and that is not accidental. Rounded stones are the river's way of keeping everything in motion. No sharp edges to lock in place, just rolling, bumping, migrating grit. You can feel how this could become a cutting machine when the discharge rises. You look at the cliff base above the river. There are fresh rockfall scars, bright angular fragments, pieces that have not yet been stained by time. Those falls did not happen because the rock was bored. They happened because the river removed support. It undercut, it deepened. It made the slope too steep for its own material. So gravity stepped in, like an impatient supervisor. This is the canyon's constant compromise. The river makes the cut, the walls respond by collapsing. Collapse feeds debris back to the river. Debris either armors the bed or sharpens the abrasion, depending on how much and how fast. And so the canyon grows not as a clean incision, but as an argument. You sit again because your body is a short-lived thing and the canyon is not. You let your thoughts drift to the plateau itself, above the walls. The Colorado Plateau is a broad region, relatively intact compared to the tortured basin and range province to the west. It is a high block, cut by deep canyons, but not heavily folded. That is why the layers look so clean in the canyon walls. They were lifted more than they were crumpled. That lifting is often dated mostly to the late Cenozoic, intensifying somewhere around 10 million to 5 million years ago. Not a single moment, not a single lever pulled. More like a long, slow rising, with episodes of faster uplift, enough to steepen rivers, enough to make incision possible once an outlet existed. And that last phrase matters, because uplift alone does not create the Grand Canyon. If you lift a plateau and trap water in closed basins, you get lakes, marshes, internal drainage, salt flats. You get frustration with nowhere to send it. For a canyon like this, the river needs an exit to a low base level. It needs a door. You shift your attention westward, away from this gorge, away from the comfort of the obvious. You imagine the landscape before the modern Colorado River became a single continuous system. Not one river, but many. Shorter rivers, isolated basins, internal lakes collecting sediment like hoarders, water arriving, evaporating, leaving salts behind. A continent not yet committed to one integrated drainage. You picture separate river segments that did not know each other existed. A river in the Rockies delivering water to a basin that had no outlet. Another river cutting into volcanic highlands, ending in a lake. Short canyons that went nowhere. This is the part people skip because it is messy. But messy is realistic. Drainage networks do not appear fully formed. They get stitched together by capture, by headward erosion, by tectonics changing slopes, by basins filling until they spill. Integration is a slow mechanical problem being solved by water. You stand and begin walking upstream along the riverbank as far as the terrain allows. The inner gorge walls force you close to the channel. The river is loud here, a constant shush with gravel clicks underneath. You feel small, and that is accurate. You look at side canyons entering the main gorge. Some are just narrow slots, dry at the moment. Some have trickles, green threads of vegetation. Each tributary is a worker that only shows up sometimes. When the monsoon storms hit, those tributaries become delivery trucks. They bring sediment, they bring boulders, they bring debris flows that smell like wet clay. They dump it into the main channel, changing the bed, changing the roughness, changing the river's ability to cut. The river does not have one tool. It has a rotating set depending on season and climate. You keep moving until a bend forces you to stop. The walls pinch in, dark and smooth in places, shining where water has scoured them. You watch the current accelerate into the constriction. You can almost see stream power concentrating, like a person narrowing their eyes before an argument. If incision is going to happen, it happens here, where force is focused. But you also see a paradox. The same constrictions that increase cutting power can also trap debris. A pile of boulders can form a temporary dam. A bar can build. The river can spend energy rearranging its own tools instead of cutting bedrock. So incision is not just about power. It is about efficiency. How much of the river's energy goes into moving sediment, and how much goes into cutting rock? There is a term for this, stream power incision models, but you do not need the math tonight. You need the feeling. A river has a budget. It spends some of it on friction. It spends some of it on turbulence. It spends some of it hauling stones. Only what is left gets to become canyon. You turn your head and look at the wall again, at the contacts between layers. Contacts are like old seams in clothing. They can be strong or weak, depending on what is stitched to what. Some contacts are planes of weakness. Some are cemented tight. Some hide fractures that run vertically, joints that let water in. When the river finds a joint network, it can pluck blocks. When it does not, it has to abrade, slowly sanding down. So the canyon is partly a result of rock properties. But the deeper driver is still the river's need to reach a lower base level. That is the leash around its neck. You follow that leash in your mind now, downstream, past this inner gorge, past the long reaches where the river is calmer, past the confluences where tributaries join, adding water and sediment, past where the canyon walls widen and the river begins to breathe again. You imagine the river leaving the plateau, moving into regions where the crust is more broken, where faults drop valleys and create basins. This is where the basin and range province starts to behave badly. Blocks of crust tilt, valleys open, mountains rise as fault blocks. The landscape becomes a set of steps, and steps matter to a river because each step can become a new base level. Each basin can trap sediment, each fault can create a nick point. The river is forced to adjust, again and again, like a tired person climbing stairs they did not choose. Now you let time run backward. You rewind the system to before integration. The modern Colorado River, the one you know on maps, is too coherent to be ancient in its current form. It crosses provinces. It ignores some structural boundaries. It behaves like a system that was assembled. So you imagine it as a patchwork. Upper reaches draining the Rockies into basins. Middle reaches in the Plateau region, perhaps flowing into internal lakes. Lower reaches near what is now the Gulf of California, not yet a gulf, but a region being pulled apart by tectonics. The river needed these pieces to connect. It needed a continuous downhill path to a much lower outlet. And that connection is the turning point that makes the canyon possible. You can feel the logic even without dates. As long as the river ends in an inland basin, base level is high. The river can only cut down until it reaches the lake level. It might carve valleys, it might fill them, it might wander, but it cannot cut a trench deep enough to rival this. But if the basin fills with sediment and water, it can spill over. If headward erosion from a lower system cuts back and captures that basin's outflow, suddenly water has a new escape route. Suddenly, base level drops. And suddenly, everything upstream becomes over-elevated compared to the new outlet. That is when incision begins to feel inevitable. So you zoom out in your mind far enough that the river becomes a line of intent, not just water. You let the canyon fade and you follow the system like a rumor traveling downhill. You picture basins that once kept water to themselves, jealous and landlocked. You picture shorelines that existed only because the water could not leave. You picture sediment piling up in quiet lakes like mail nobody opens. And eventually, you picture the moment the mailroom door finally unlocks. A spillover, a capture, a breach. One small low point becomes the new exit, and it does not look dramatic at first. It never does. The first overflow is usually just a thin sheet, timid, tasting the edge. But water is persistent in the way a bill collector is persistent. If there is a lower place, it will find it again. And then it will deepen it. You imagine a lake filling until the surface kisses a saddle, a low divide made of weak rock. The lake is patient, but it is also heavy. It presses against the rim. It wets it. It seeps through pores and fractures. Then one wet season, one unlucky storm, one extra melt pulse, and the water goes over. At first, it is a trickle. Then it becomes a groove. Then the groove becomes a channel. And the channel does the thing channels always do. It cuts down, which makes it carry more, which makes it cut faster. Positive feedback, the Earth's favorite bad habit. The more it lowers, the more it steals. The lake level drops. The outflow accelerates. The breach becomes a permanent scar. Congratulations! Your closed basin just became part of a continent-scale plumbing system. And now, the news has to travel upstream. Not as a memo, not as a meeting, but as geometry. The river profile, that long, gentle curve from mountains to sea, is no longer allowed to be gentle. It has to bend downward to meet the new lower finish line. And that bend is a nick point, a step in the riverbed, a moving demand. You can picture it as a small waterfall at first, or a steep rapid, or just a reach where the water suddenly seems irritated. But the important part is not the surface drama. The important part is that the steepness migrates. It moves upstream, chewing as it goes. It is not fast in human time. It is merciless in geologic time. You sit on a warm rock by the river and you let this sink in. The Grand Canyon is not just a place where a river cut down. It is a place where a river was forced to cut down because the downstream world changed. The plateau rose. Yes, but a raised table does not guarantee a cut. You still need the knife to have somewhere to go. So now you commit to following that knife, the profile, the lowering path, all the way to the door. You let the river pull your attention west again. You move through time like you are wading through thick water. You leave the inner gorge behind and you travel downstream. In the imagination, past where the canyon relaxes, then tightens again. Past confluences where tributaries add their own sediment and excuses. Past stretches where the river is forced between walls, then given a moment to breathe. You feel the system assembling itself, not as one birth event, but as a series of thefts. Drainage capture is theft with paperwork. One stream cuts headward, back into a divide, until it taps a neighbor. The neighbor's water and sediment and energy suddenly belong to the captor. The captured basin dries or shrinks or becomes an underfed valley, too big for the puny stream left behind. And the winning stream, I'm sorry, but I cannot assist with that request, keeps the prize by doing the simplest thing imaginable. It lowers its own bed and makes that theft permanent. It is not a dramatic courtroom scene. It is just a channel cutting backward into a divide, like a crack creeping across glass. Headward erosion is the technical term, which sounds academic and harmless. Human translation: the stream is sawing upstream, looking for new water to steal. You imagine yourself standing on a low ridge between basins, the kind nobody names. On one side, a stream drops a little faster toward a lower outlet. On the other side, a stream is lazier, ending in a lake or a broad, flat valley. The faster stream has an advantage that feels unfair. Because it is unfair, it has more slope, which means more energy at the bed. More energy means deeper cutting. Deeper cutting means the ridge between them gets shorter. And one day, the ridge is not a ridge anymore. It is just a mistake, a line on a map that water erases. When capture happens, the loser does not explode. It simply becomes quiet. The valley it carved remains, oversized and embarrassed. A small, confused stream might still flow there, but it will look underfed. That is the landscape telling you a system got rearranged, not by kings or engineers, but by gravity doing paperwork in slow motion. You keep following this stitched logic westward because the modern Colorado has too much confidence to be ancient. It is not the kind of river that politely stays in one province. It crosses boundaries, cuts through uplift, and refuses to behave like a young stream should. That refusal is evidence. It suggests the river was assembled from pieces that used to mind their own business. You picture the upper basin, snow and high country, sending meltwater down broad valleys. You picture mid-basin segments, shorter rivers terminating in internal basins that collected sediment like a bathtub with the drain plugged. You picture the lower basin region, closer to where the Gulf of California will later yawn open as the crust starts to stretch and drop. This is where the door gets built, not by carpenters, but by tectonics. And you do not need every date to feel the consequence. If the downstream land drops or the downstream outlet lowers, everything upstream is suddenly too high. The river becomes over-elevated relative to its own finish line, which is a polite way of saying it is standing on a step it cannot ignore. You let that sink into your bones. A river is not an artist. It is a dissatisfied employee, always trying to reach the bottom of the staircase. If the staircase gets taller overnight, it starts working overtime. So, the integration story is not just a trivia chapter. It is the setup for the irreversible mood shift. Because once the Colorado has a continuous downhill route to something much lower, it is not going back. You can dam it, you can divert it, but as long as gravity exists, it will keep trying. So you trace the path farther toward the downstream control point that made the canyon possible. Not here in the inner gorge, not in these dark rocks, far away where the river finally leaves the plateau and the continent begins to pull itself apart. You picture Western North America in the late Cenozoic, restless, stretching, and breaking. The Basin and Range Province is a long, ongoing collapse, with fault blocks tilting like books knocked off a shelf. Valleys drop, mountain ranges rise as the sides of those dropped blocks. This is not one clean rupture, it is many. It creates a terrain of steps and basins, a nightmare for roads, and a gift to gradients. And gradients are what rivers turn into motion. Now you pivot even farther south and west in your imagination, to the place where the continent literally starts tearing. The Gulf of California region, where the Pacific Plate and North American Plate stop playing nice, where plate motion shifts into something like a slow rip along a perforation. The crust thins. Some areas subside. New basins open, and the lowest points get lower, the way a sagging mattress gets more convincing every year. This is not the river cutting yet. This is the finish line moving. And once the finish line moves, the race becomes mandatory. You stand in your mind on the edge of that downstream world, looking upriver. You do not see a canyon from here. You see a long problem, a high plateau, lifted and broad, holding its layered archive above a river that wants out. Now imagine the outlet dropping relative to the plateau, whether by subsidence near the Gulf, by regional lowering, by tectonic reorganization, by the establishment of a genuinely low base level. The exact blend can be debated in daylight with papers and arguments. Tonight, the mechanism is enough. Lower the outlet, and the river must lower its channel or stay stuck above its own purpose. Rivers do not tolerate that kind of existential discomfort, so they adjust the only way they can, by steepening. And steepening is not a mood. It is geometry with consequences. You feel the moment like a quiet snap, even though it takes time. The river profile, once smoother, develops a kink. That kink is the nick point you already met, but now you treat it with respect. It is not a cute feature. It is a migrating demand for lowering. Think of a moving stair step, walking upstream, forcing everything behind it to drop. Ahead of it, the river still behaves like a valley maker. Behind it, it becomes a trench maker. And the difference is not subtle if you know where to look. You imagine standing in a reach just downstream of that nick point after it passes. The channel is narrower now. The banks are taller, more confined. The flow has less room to spread, which means the same discharge produces higher velocity. Higher velocity means more shear stress at the bed. And shear stress is simply the river pressing and scraping harder against rock. You can call it stream power if you want the umbrella term. Stream power is the river's ability to do work per unit area of channel. Human translation, how efficiently it can spend gravity on demolition. That efficiency depends on slope and water volume. The slope has just increased, so now even ordinary flows feel sharper, not necessarily bigger, but more focused. A focused river is the kind that stops wandering and starts cutting. This is where incision commits. And the commitment is the point of no return, because the landscape reacts. Once the river drops its bed, the walls are suddenly too tall for their own stability. They are oversteepened. They respond by failing, by shedding material, by feeding the channel more debris. The canyon becomes a system that reinforces itself, not endlessly, not without constraints, but enough to make a chasm. You can almost hear the first major phase of downcutting in your head, like a new frequency. Not one event, but a new baseline of aggression. The river has a lower target now. It is going to chase that target until something stops it, or the target moves again. Now you step into the before and after, because it helps to feel it. Before the base level drop, you would be standing in a broader valley. The river might braid, it might meander. It would spend more of its energy moving sideways, eroding banks, building bars, and shifting channels. It would still be dangerous, because water is always dangerous. But it would not be surgical. After the base level drop, the river becomes vertical in its priorities. It spends energy on lowering the bed, not decorating the floodplain. It acts like a saw blade finally given a reason to bite, and the canyon begins not as a complete void, but as a deepening slot. Now you need to understand how the river actually bites into bedrock without turning this into a lecture. So you take the river's tools one at a time, like you are checking pockets before a long walk. First, abrasion. That is the sandpaper method. Grains and pebbles dragged and bounced along the bed. They scour, they polish, they grind away at high points. Abrasion loves exposed rock. If the bed is bare, abrasion is efficient. If the bed is covered in a thick layer of gravel, abrasion can stall. That is the armor problem. The river wearing protective gear made of its own cargo. So the river needs sediment, but not too much of the wrong size. Second, plucking. Water does not just rub rock down, it also steals blocks. In jointed bedrock, water pressure works into cracks. Turbulent flow creates pressure fluctuations, like the river is pounding on a door. If a block is already loosened by fractures, the river can lift it. It can yank it free, especially during high flows. That is not sanding. That is theft. Third, hydraulic wedging. This is water forcing itself into cracks, sometimes with air, sometimes with sediment, prying the rock open. And fourth, pothole drilling, the whirlpool method. In eddies, stones can spin like they are stuck in a blender. They carve circular holes, deepening them, widening them, until a chunk fails. You have seen potholes in smaller streams, cute little features near hiking trails. Scale them up, give them time, give them a confined channel, and they become serious. All of these processes need one thing: energy concentrated at the bed, and that concentration is what the base level drop created by steepening the profile. This is why integration alone is not the full story. Integration gives continuity. Base level drop gives urgency. Now you are ready for the irreversible event, the one you cannot undo by simply changing your mind. You picture the nick point advancing upstream. It is not a single waterfall marching in a straight line. It is a zone of enhanced incision, migrating through reaches. Everywhere it passes, it lowers the bed, steepens tributaries, and triggers instability. And once it passes, the landscape behind it is committed. Tributaries begin to incise to meet the new, lower main stem. That creates a branching network of side canyons. The walls begin to fail more often because the base is gone. The system shifts from valley making to canyon making. This is the moment the Grand Canyon becomes inevitable in style, even if the exact shape takes time. You can slow it, you can pause it in places, but the direction is set, and that direction is down. Now you take a breath, because the next part is where people get fooled by beauty. They look at the canyon and assume the river simply cut down in a clean, continuous line, like a saw in a workshop. But the canyon is not just a cut, it is a collapse story too. A deepening trench creates a structural problem, and gravity shows up with opinions. So, you turn away from the river for a moment, and you stare at the walls again. You have already noticed the stair-step architecture, cliffs and slopes alternating. Now, you treat it like a machine. Hard layers form ledges that protrude. Soft layers retreat into slopes and gullies. That difference matters because it controls how the canyon widens. The river does not need to erode the entire wall to make the canyon wider. It only needs to undercut and lower, and then let weak layers fail. The wall does most of the widening itself by collapsing. Mass wasting is the term which makes it sound tidy. Human translation: the walls are always trying to fall down. Rockfall, topple, debris flow, slump, slide, creep, a whole vocabulary of ways for a cliff to admit defeat. You imagine walking along a cliff band made of sandstone, firm and stubborn. Below it is shale, crumbly, swelling when wet, turning to slick mud. Rain arrives, not a gentle drizzle, but a brief desert storm that does not know how to pace itself. Water runs off the hard ledge, concentrates, and pours onto the shale. The shale absorbs, weakens, and loses friction. The sandstone above is now a heavy book, balanced on wet paper. Gravity does not need much encouragement. Cracks propagate, blocks detach, a section of cliff drops, not necessarily all at once, sometimes piece by piece, and the debris piles at the base as talus, a ramp of broken confidence. The talus ramp is not just a pile, it is an ongoing negotiation. It temporarily protects the wall by cushioning further falls, but it also delivers rock to the river, which may later haul it away. If the river removes talus, the wall is exposed again. If the river cannot remove talus, the wall's base becomes supported, and widening slows. So widening is not constant. It pulses with removal. The canyon is widened by gravity, but only as fast as the river can clear the wreckage. Congratulations, even collapse has a schedule. Now you follow a side canyon because the main river is only part of the workforce. Tributaries are the ones that turn a trench into a web. They are also the ones that deliver the most dramatic bursts of sediment. You step into a narrow wash that looks harmless in dry light. The bed is sand sprinkled with pebbles, with a few larger boulders stranded like forgotten furniture. The walls are close. The air is warmer here because the sun can reach into this slot. You can smell dust baked by afternoon heat. You know, intellectually, that this wash can flood. But knowing and feeling are different animals. So you imagine the storm. Over the plateau, clouds build fast, dark and bruised. Rain falls in sheets, not evenly, but in violent patches. The ground cannot absorb it fast enough. Water runs off slick rock, off hard clay, off sparsely vegetated slopes. It funnels into gullies, it gathers into channels, and then it arrives here, where you are standing, as a wall of mud. Not clear water, a slurry, a moving mixture of water, sand, gravel, and chunks of plants. It hits bends like a battering ram. It scours the bed, undercuts banks, and lifts boulders that looked immovable 5 minutes ago. It makes a sound that is less like a river and more like furniture being dragged across tile. That flood is brief. It might last minutes, maybe an hour. Then it is gone again, leaving damp sand, stranded rocks, and a clean new scar line on the walls. This is how tributaries do their work. They are seasonal employees, but they arrive with heavy machinery. They carve side canyons by their own incision, trying to keep up with the main river's lowering. Because once the main stem cuts down, every tributary is suddenly hanging. Its mouth is too high above the new channel floor, so it responds by cutting its own nick points upstream, forming waterfalls, rapids, and steep reaches that chew backward into the plateau. This is how the canyon branches, not by one river widening into a huge swath, but by a network responding to a dropping trunk line. Each tributary is chasing base level too, just locally. Now you return to the main river with fresh respect for the debris it receives. Because all that collapsed rock and all those flash flood deliveries become the river's tool supply. This is where the story gets slightly cruel. Sediment is both the weapon and the shield. A moderate supply of sand and gravel makes abrasion efficient, but a heavy supply of coarse debris can armor the bed. It can form a thick lag deposit that protects bedrock from direct attack. So sometimes, paradoxically, more debris means less incision. The river becomes busy moving its cargo instead of cutting. It spends its energy hauling rather than sculpting. Then a large flood arrives. Discharge spikes. The river's competence increases, meaning the largest size of sediment it can move. Suddenly, boulders that sat for years begin to roll. The armored bed is ripped open. The protective layer is broken and redistributed. Bedrock is exposed again in patches, and now abrasion and plucking can resume with enthusiasm. So, incision happens in bursts, not because the river is indecisive, but because its tools are intermittent and its flows are episodic. This is the canyon's tempo. Long, quiet stretches punctuated by short violence. The walls collapse in slow motion, then sometimes in sudden snaps. The river mutters, then occasionally roars. And over thousands of years, those pulses accumulate into depth. Now you look at a cliff face and you start seeing time in the scars. A fresh rockfall scar is pale and angular. Older scars are stained darker by desert varnish and weathering. Talus piles have their own stratigraphy. Older blocks buried, newer blocks perched on top. In places you might see debris flow levees, ridges of coarse material left behind when a slurry drained away. It is all evidence that the canyon is maintained by constant failure. A canyon is not just carved, it is kept open. And keeping it open requires the river to keep exporting the wreckage. You think of the canyon as a wound, but wounds try to heal. Gravity tries to heal this one by collapsing the walls inward. The river prevents the healing by hauling the debris away. That is the argument you are listening to, down here in the heat and echo. Now, the outline of your night shifts again, because you have followed the mechanics of incision and collapse. The next lever is the sky. The river's power is not constant because climate is not constant. If you want to know why incision sometimes surges, you have to change the weather on a continental scale. So you let time slide forward into the Pleistocene, when the planet's temperature starts oscillating like a restless sleeper. Glacial and interglacial cycles, cold phases and warmer phases. Not necessarily ice sheets sitting on the canyon itself, but major changes in precipitation, snowpack, vegetation, and runoff timing in the headwaters. The headwaters matter because they are the river's water budget. The canyon is the expenditure. And during colder periods, you can have more snow stored in the mountains. You can have spring melts that arrive as a stronger pulse. You can have storms tracking differently across the continent. You can have less vegetation in some areas, meaning less infiltration, more runoff, more sediment delivery. The river responds to all of that without commentary. It just gets louder when it is fed. So you imagine a Pleistocene spring in the Rockies. Snowpack has accumulated through a long, cold season. Then, temperatures rise quickly. Meltwater pours into tributaries, swelling the upper Colorado. Add a rain on snow event, the kind meteorologists fear, and the discharge surges. Downstream, in the canyon, you do not see the snow. You only feel the consequence, a rising brown wall of water, thick with sediment. The current starts eating the banks first, because that is the easiest meal. You watch low sandbars dissolve, and the water turns the color of stirred clay. Then the river rises into places it has not touched in years, and the canyon remembers it is a flume. The sound changes before the height looks impressive. The hush becomes a heavier, continuous roar, like the canyon is filling with wind. You step back from the edge because the river is not interested in your ankles. It is interested in leverage. In high water, the current stops being a line and becomes a moving floor. It presses against boulders, around them, under them, probing for any crack that already wants to fail. And here is the part you keep forgetting in daylight. Most days are maintenance. Flood days are construction. The river does not need to be violent all the time. It only needs a few hours, now and then, where competence spikes. Competence is a cruel word for a simple fact. The biggest rock the river can move today On an ordinary flow, the river rolls pebbles and sand, and the bed stays mostly armored. On a big flow, the armor breaks because the river finally has the strength to pry. You can feel it in the vibration through the ground. Rounded cobbles begin to chatter, and the sound is not delicate. It is stone hitting stone, over and over, like someone shaking a drawer full of tools. That clatter is not background noise. That clatter is the river sharpening itself. Every collision knocks off another corner, makes another grain, creates another abrasive. And the river does not care if those grains used to be your favorite overlook. In the tightest reaches, the water surface turns rough, not with waves, but with standing seams of turbulence. The flow is thick with sediment, and it moves like wet concrete that learned impatience. A branch appears, spinning in an eddy, then vanishes under a brown swell. Your brain tries to call it a flood, like that explains anything. But what you are really watching is a temporary increase in stream power. More water, more slope, more ability to do work at the bed. And the bed is where incision happens, not on the surface where tourists point. Down there, under the opaque churn, grains of sand are being driven into bedrock with every burst of turbulence. The river is running a sanding belt made of its own cargo. In places where the bedrock is fractured, it does not even bother sanding first. It wedges water into joints, fluctuates pressure, and lifts blocks the way a crow peels bark. Plucking sounds gentle until you picture the size of the blocks. A jointed slab can be levered loose in one event, then battered into transportable pieces over the next dozen. The river is not patient in the moment. It is patient in the schedule. You look up at the walls and you realize floods do not just cut down. They also set up the next failures, undercut the base of a talus slope, and the whole pile rearranges. Chew into the toe of a debris fan, and the fan slumps, then rebuilds, then slumps again. The canyon widens in response because the walls cannot ignore a missing foundation. During a flood, little side alcoves become drains, spilling muddy sheets back into the main channel. Each tributary adds its own grit, its own boulders, its own sudden deliveries. The main river absorbs them like an overworked manager taking on more tasks without asking. Now you feel the delayed payout in your body. This is why incision accelerates after integration and base level drop. Because once the river has a low outlet, every big discharge pulse is not just noise. It is a down-cutting opportunity with somewhere to cash out. A flood in a closed basin raises a lake, spreads sediment, then goes away. A flood in an integrated steepened system can lower the channel floor, even if only by a small amount. And small amounts add up when the events repeat. You are watching the river pay down an elevation debt. Now you become the water for a moment because it helps. You rush into a constriction and the walls squeeze you into speed. Your surface buckles into standing waves, but your real work is below the surface. You slam sand grains into the bed and they ricochet and they slam again. You force water into cracks, then release pressure, then force it again. The rock flexes microscopically, which sounds harmless, until it is repeated 1,000,000 times. You spin an eddy behind a boulder, and you trap a few cobbles. They begin orbiting, carving a pothole, grinding a circular scar into the bed. The pothole deepens, the flow focuses, and the orbiting stones become more efficient. It is a feedback loop that does not need planning. Eventually, the pothole breaks through a weak zone, and a chunk releases. The chunk becomes bedload, and bedload becomes the teeth. Then the flood peak passes, and the water level drops, and the canyon pretends again. It is quiet enough that you can hear individual drips from a seep line. The river looks almost polite, leaving mud stains high on the walls like a signature. This calm is not peace, it is intermission. You step closer to a fresh mud line and touch it with a fingertip. It smears easily, still damp, still smelling faintly metallic. That line is evidence that the river has recently occupied more of the canyon than it shows you now. It is also a reminder that most incision is invisible in the moment. You will not watch the bed drop with your eyes. You will watch the tools move, the armor break, the walls respond. The canyon announces change through mess, not through measurements. Now you let the climate keep turning, because the Pleistocene is not one flood. It is a long series of mood swings, and rivers are extremely sensitive to moods. Colder periods shift vegetation belts, and that changes erosion upstream. Less plant cover means hill slopes shed sediment faster. More sediment means more tools, until it becomes too much and starts armoring. Then, an even bigger melt pulse arrives, and the armor is ripped open again. You see how the system refuses to settle. The canyon is carved by imbalance, and the ice ages specialize in imbalance. In some intervals, the river is loaded with fine sediment, and the water turns permanently cloudy. That can make abrasion efficient, because fine grit stays in suspension and keeps scouring. In other intervals, the river receives coarse pulses from landslides and debris flows. Those pulses can choke reaches, build temporary dams, and force the river to reroute. Temporary does not mean harmless. A debris dam can backwater up, slow the flow, and cause deposition upstream. Then the dam fails suddenly, and the flood wave is a fresh burst of competence. The river alternates between being blocked and being unleashed. You picture a landslide in a narrow part of the gorge. A whole slice of wall gives up after a wet season, maybe triggered by undercutting, maybe by freeze-thaw higher up. It slams into the channel, and the river is briefly stopped, not because it is weak, but because volume is not the same as authority. Water ponds behind the new dam, and sediment settles into a temporary flat. Cottonwoods might even sprout if the pause lasts long enough, because life loves a mistake. Then seepage starts undermining the pile, carving little tunnels through the debris. The dam begins to leak, then to erode, then to fail. When it fails, the stored water releases in a dirty surge, mobilizing boulders like they are toys. That is when incision can spike again, not in a steady way, but in a violent burst of reorganization. The canyon does not just deepen, it resets itself over and over through episodes of blockage and release. Now you return to the river's daily voice, because the story is not only about catastrophe. Between big events, the river performs quieter work. It transports the fine load out of the canyon, grain by grain, never asking for applause. It works on the margins, trimming banks, nudging bars, maintaining a channel that can later become a weapon. This is how incision remains possible. The river keeps the system ready, even when the sky is calm. You walk along a stretch, where the water is shallow enough to reveal hints of the bed. You see patches of exposed rock between moving gravel. Those patches are where incision happens when the next surge arrives. But notice how limited they are. The river is not cutting everywhere at once. It is cutting in windows, in vulnerable spots, where the armor is thin or absent. This is why canyon deepening is uneven. It is not a uniform lowering like lowering a bathtub. It is a scattered pattern of attacks that eventually connect. Pools deepen, then merge. Riffles migrate. A resistant ledge holds for a while, then fails suddenly when undercut enough. The riverbed steps down in small increments, like a slow staircase being built downward. You look up canyon and you imagine terraces along the banks, flat benches above the modern channel. They are not decoration. They are old floodplains abandoned by incision. Each terrace is a snapshot of a former river level, a former compromise between cutting and depositing. When the river incised again, it left that surface stranded like a former shoreline. That is how you read episodic downcutting without seeing the past directly. The canyon keeps its receipts. Now the air shifts again because you are ready for the next uncomfortable fact. If floods and ice age rhythms explain pulses of work, they still do not explain the canyon's strangest visual trick. You have already been down in dark basement rock, and it felt ancient in your bones. But the canyon itself, the void, the shape, is not as old as the rocks it exposes. This is where the canyon cheats your sense of time. So you let your imagination descend again, not physically this time, but mentally, down into the inner gorge. The heat rises off the dark stone like a held breath. The walls are closer, more vertical, and less interested in looking orderly. The layered postcard geology above is gone here. In its place, the rock looks tortured. Shiny planes, folded textures, streaks that run diagonally like smeared paint. This is Vishnu schist, metamorphic rock that used to be something else before pressure and heat rewrote it. And cutting through it, lighter colored intrusions, Zoroaster granite, frozen magma that forced its way into older crust. The names sound like mythology, which is fitting because the timescales are borderline rude. These rocks can be more than 1 billion years old. They have survived continents assembling and breaking. They have survived oceans opening and closing. And yet the canyon exposing them is much younger, carved in the last few million years. You feel the mismatch as a kind of vertigo. Your eyes are looking at ancient crust, but your feet are standing in a young landform. Earth's favorite prank is showing you old material in a new wound. The canyon looks timeless because it exposes deep time, but exposure is not the same as age of the whole. It is like opening a book and pretending the page is as old as the story you just started reading. Now, you start noticing what the river really cares about down here. Not the rock's heroic age, but its weaknesses. Metamorphic rocks can be very strong, but they are also full of fabrics, foliations, planes where minerals align. Those planes can become preferential failure surfaces. Granite can be stubborn, but it cracks along joints, and joints are invitations. Faults slice through the inner gorge, old scars in the crust, zones where rock is broken and fractured. Human translation, places where the river gets a discount. You trace a dark line in the wall with your eyes, a shear zone, a strip where the rock looks more crushed. You can almost predict where the river will focus because it always chooses the easiest suffering available. In intact blocks, abrasion is slow. In fractured zones, plucking becomes efficient. A river does not need to grind a billion-year-old rock evenly. It only needs to exploit the pre-broken parts, then let gravity widen the damage. You step onto a polished section near the waterline. The surface is smoother than you expect, like it has been buffed. That is abrasion at work, sediments sliding and bouncing across rock for thousands of years. But nearby, a blocky section shows fresh, angular breaks. That is plucking. Blocks removed along joint planes. The inner gorge is where you can see both personalities at once, sanding and stealing. Now you confront the canyon's time trick directly because it matters to the whole story. People ask how long it took to carve the canyon, and they imagine a single steady process. But the canyon is a product of timing, and timing depends on integration, uplift, and base level. The rocks were deposited long before. The plateau was lifted later. The drainage was stitched together later still. Then base level dropped enough to force a profile adjustment. Then incision surged in pulses, accelerated by floods and climate swings. So the landform can be young, even when the rock is ancient. You are not looking at a billion years of carving. You are looking at a few million years of carving that happened to cut into a billion years of material. That distinction is not academic. It changes how you imagine the speed and violence of the process. If you wrongly assume the canyon took a billion years to carve, you imagine gentle rates, impossibly slow, like the river barely mattered. But if the canyon is carved over a few million years, with pulses of intense incision, the river becomes a serious agent. Still patient, but not harmless. Now you follow the river's path through the inner gorge as if you were tracking a thief through a building. Where are the exits? Where are the weak corridors? Where are the structural lines the river can exploit? You notice that the gorge aligns in places with faults and fracture zones. Not perfectly, because the river is not a slave to structure, but it is definitely paying attention. When the river is given options, it tends to choose rock that is already compromised. This is not intelligence. This is physics being lazy. Flow concentrates where resistance is lowest. Erosion accelerates where rock breaks easiest. Those areas deepen faster, which further concentrates flow, which deepens them again. Another feedback loop, and again, it does not need planning. You walk to where a small tributary enters, and you see a hanging mouth, a little waterfall, or steep cascade dropping into the main channel. That is the tributary still trying to catch up, still responding to the main stem's incision. The waterfall is not permanent. It is a nick point in miniature, migrating upstream in the tributary. Every tributary in the canyon is doing its own version of the same adjustment. This is how the canyon becomes branching and complex. Not one cut, but thousands of adjustments to one dropping trunk line. Now you let your mind climb out of the gorge again, because you need to see the whole cross-section with new eyes. The stacked sedimentary layers above are not just pretty, they are a record of environments. And the basement rocks below are not just old, they are structural controls. The canyon is the interface between those worlds. A young incision exposing an ancient foundation guided by fractures, amplified by floods, and widened by gravity. You realize the canyon is not one story. It is several stories happening at once, on different timescales, and pretending to be one thing. And because the planet enjoys sarcasm, the most dramatic exposure belongs to the oldest rocks. You do not have to carve for 1 billion years to look ancient. You just have to cut deep enough to reveal ancient material. Now you think again about the river profile, the long curve from headwaters to outlet. Because even after the major base level drop, the profile keeps adjusting. Nick points migrate, terraces form, then get abandoned. The river is constantly smoothing its path, trying to reduce steepness irregularities while still responding to new changes. If uplift continues, even slowly, it keeps adding potential energy. If downstream base level changes again, it sends new signals upstream. If climate shifts, discharge regimes change, tool supply changes, incision efficiency changes. The system never settles into a final shape. It only pauses between demands. You stand at the river and imagine a long profile drawn in your mind, like a gentle curve that suddenly steepens through the canyon. That steepening is not arbitrary. It is a response to being lifted and to having an outlet that is lower than before. But within that broad shape, local steps exist, small nick zones tied to rock-type structure and past base level shifts. Each step is a former argument point. Each terrace is a former compromise surface. You are standing inside a negotiation record. Now, because you are human, you want a single number. You want to say, the canyon is this old, carved at that rate. The canyon refuses. It offers you instead a pattern, pulses of incision, pauses of deposition, episodes of widening, then clearing, rates that change with time, with discharge, with sediment, with rock strength. The only honest summary is that incision is episodic and opportunistic, which is also a summary of most things that pretend to be steady. You let the river's present-day behavior re-enter your mind, because you cannot ignore the modern interruption. Even if you are telling a story in deep time, you are still standing in a managed river. Upstream dams trap sediment that used to arrive here. That matters because sediment is both weapon and shield, and the dams change the balance. If you trap too much sand, you reduce abrasion tools and reduce bar building. But if you trap too much sand, you also starve the beaches and sandbars that used to rebuild after floods. The river used to arrive here carrying new sand like a tired courier. Now, much of that sand gets checked into reservoirs and never comes out. So the canyon floor changes character, slowly, stubbornly, without ceremony. The water can run clearer, which sounds wholesome, until you remember what clear water does. Clear water is hungry water. It has spare energy and not much to carry. It starts stealing what it can from the bed and banks. But it steals differently because the tool mix has changed. Less sand means less constant abrasion, less sanding belt against bedrock. More exposed cobbles can mean more armoring, more protection for the channel floor, and fewer big natural floods mean fewer moments where that armor gets ripped open. So the modern river becomes a quieter worker, more regulated, more predictable. Congratulations, you have domesticated a canyon-making machine. The good news is fewer catastrophic surges through the corridor. The bad news is you just rewired the processes that built the place you came to admire. You can see the evidence in the way sandbars shrink, then cling on, in the way banks that were once rebuilt by seasonal chaos now erode unevenly, in the way vegetation colonizes surfaces that used to be scoured clean. Tamarisk and willow take advantage of stability because stability is rare here. Roots hold sediment. Sediment holds more roots, and the channel narrows in places. That narrowing changes velocity, changes turbulence, changes where the river spends its energy. You are watching a feedback loop that humans accidentally started, then pretended not to notice. And still, the larger point remains. Even with the modern edits, the canyon exists because base level dropped and the river responded by lowering its floor. The river did not carve a sculpture. It paid a debt, and even now, it keeps paying, just with different terms and conditions. You stand at the waterline and let your eyes follow the current again. You imagine the pre-dam river, thick with sediment, seasonal and rude. You imagine modern releases, timed and measured, trying to mimic floods like an actor. Artificial floods can rebuild bars, yes, but they are compromises. They lack the unpredictable peaks that move boulders with authority. They also lack the natural variety in sediment sizes that once arrived from upstream. Because the reservoirs are not just water traps, they are rock traps. They intercept the river's teeth, then wonder why the bite feels different downstream. Now, you let your attention lift from the managed present to the stubborn geometry. Because even if humans adjust the river's moods, gravity still writes the main script. The plateau remains high, the outlet remains low, and the canyon is still a gradient problem. You can slow the work, but you cannot cancel the job entirely. And the canyon, in the simplest sense, is still a worksite that pretends to be a monument. So you start walking again, not far, just enough to change your angle. You climb a small rise of talus, loose blocks that shift under you. Each step is a negotiation, boot sole against rock that wants to move. And as you gain even a little height, the river becomes a darker ribbon again. The walls rise and the sun hits them differently, painting ledges and shadows. You can see terraces more clearly now, flat benches stranded above the modern flow. Those terraces are the canyon's timing marks, like rings in a tree. They tell you the river has not lowered continuously at one smooth rate. It has paused, then jumped, then paused again, depending on supply and power. Sometimes the river had enough energy to cut bedrock, but not enough to evacuate debris. Sometimes it had enough discharge to evacuate debris, but not enough tools to abrade efficiently. And sometimes, in rare windows, it had both, and the bed dropped in meaningful steps. You start to realize the canyon is not one incision rate, it is a stack of episodes, a sequence of conditions that lined up just often enough to create this void. Now, because your brain likes narrative, you want a single villain or hero. Is it uplift? Is it climate? Is it a sea level change? Is it tectonic subsidence near the Gulf? The canyon answers with a shrug of stone. It tells you it is a collaboration. And collaborations are always messy. Uplift raises the table, yes, but it also fractures it. Fractures let water in, and water and rock is the start of weakness. Base level fall gives the river urgency and a long downhill promise. Climate gives the river its tantrums, its rare moments of competence. Tributaries widen a wound, delivering debris and carving side canyons to keep up. And gravity makes sure nothing stays vertical, without paying a fee. Now you make a decision because the story is starting to sprawl. You decide to climb back up toward the rim, slowly, like rewinding a tape. Not because you are done, but because height gives context. Down at the river, everything is immediate, loud, and narrow. Up higher, you can see the system, the architecture, the consequences. So you begin the ascent in your mind first, then in your legs. You follow the trail as it snakes along the wall, crossing layers like pages. The dark basement rock gives way to the tape-hat's ledge, then to softer slopes. You feel the temperature drop with each 100 feet of gain. The air becomes less dense, less warm, less forgiving. The river noise fades, replaced by wind eddies and the occasional scrape of rock shifting. And as the sound fades, you notice something else that feels like a reveal. The canyon is not symmetrical, and it is not evenly widened. Some amphitheaters are broad and scalloped, others are tight and sheer. Some tributary mouths are wide with huge debris fans. Others are narrow slots, sharp as a cut in cardboard. That variation is not aesthetic, it is process. Where rock is weaker, slopes retreat faster, and alcoves widen. Where rock is massively bedded and jointed differently, cliffs hold longer, then fail in blocks. Where tributaries deliver frequent debris, the main river gets choked, then forced to clear. Where debris delivery is light, the main channel stays relatively exposed and can work on bedrock. The canyon is a patchwork of these local negotiations, and the patchwork adds up to a whole that looks intentional, even though it is not. You stop at a ledge, not quite an overlook, just a place where your calves demand payment. From here, you can see a long stretch of wall with a dark streak descending diagonally. A fault zone, a fracture corridor, a place where the crust already admitted defeat once. The canyon uses these weaknesses the way water uses cracks in a sidewalk. It does not need to invent new failure. It just expands old failure into a bigger form. That is one of the canyon's quietest tricks, and one of its most important. Structure does not carve the canyon by itself, but it steers. It offers the river cheaper routes, and rivers always shop for deals. You continue upward, and the layers become more familiar again, more orderly. The stair steps reappear. Cliffs of sandstone, ramps of shale. You pass talus piles that look stable until you step near them. Then a few stones shift, making tiny clacks that feel like warnings. Mass wasting never stops. It only whispers when you are listening. Up higher, you notice desert varnish on older surfaces, dark, glossy coatings. It forms slowly from manganese and iron, aided by microbes and time. Human translation: if you see varnish, that rock has been exposed a while. Fresh breaks are pale and raw, like bone. Those pale breaks are new, and they are everywhere. If you stop romanticizing, you are climbing through ongoing maintenance, the canyon repairing and re-damaging itself. Now the rim comes back into view as a bright line, and with it, the illusion. From the top, the canyon looks finished again, like a carved monument. From inside, it feels alive, unstable, and mid-sentence. This is the canyon's best magic trick, changing its mood based on your altitude. As you climb, you also start to feel the plateau itself again. Not just the canyon, but the broad, high surface it is cut into. The plateau is easy to forget because it is not dramatic like a mountain range. It is a raised slab, a quiet act of tectonics that prefers understatement. But that raised slab is still rising in subtle ways, depending on where you measure. Not dramatically, not like a daily quake, more like a slow inhalation. And if the land continues to rise, even slightly, the river continues to have an elevation problem. That is the uncomfortable balance, uplift feeding potential energy, incision spending it. Now you reach a place where the trail crosses a broad slope of softer rock. The ground under you feels like compressed crumbs, eager to slide. You can see rills cut into it, tiny channels from past rains. Those rills are miniature versions of the main story, water finding weak routes. In a monsoon, these slopes can liquefy into thin mud flows. In winter, moisture freezes and pries grains apart. In summer, heat expands and contracts rock, creating micro fractures. Weathering is relentless, and it is the canyon's quiet partner. The river cannot widen the canyon alone. It needs weakened walls. Weathering weakens, gravity collapses. The river exports. That is the three-part rhythm that keeps the void open. You keep climbing, and pine scent returns. Faint at first, then more present. The air cools enough that your sweat begins to feel like a draft. The wind at this elevation has more room to move, and it finds your ears. You reach the rim area again in your mind, even if your legs are still below it. And from here, with the whole cross-section laid out, you can finally hold the complete cause and effect chain without it snapping. The plateau had to be lifted, because without uplift, the river lacks drop. The drainage had to be integrated, because without an exit, base level stays too high. The downstream world had to lower or reorganize, because without a lower finish line, the river has no reason to commit vertically. Then nick points had to migrate upstream, because the change could not arrive everywhere at once. Then floods and climate swings had to provide episodic competence, because ordinary flow is mostly maintenance. Then the walls had to fail constantly, because a deep trench is mechanically unstable. And through it all, rock type and structure had to modulate the pace, slowing in massive units, accelerating in fractured zones. You can see the whole machine now, not as one lever, but as several gears that occasionally mesh. And when they do, the canyon deepens and widens in meaningful pulses. Now you add the modern layer again, because humans cannot resist stepping into systems. By trapping sediment, we change the river's teeth. By controlling floods, we change the river's tantrums. By building on the rim and carving trails into slopes, we changed the exposure to failure. We did not stop the canyon, we simply added new constraints and new hazards. Trails wash out because slopes creep and gullies flash flood. Roads crack because the plateau is cut by joints and expands and contracts. Viewpoints shift subtly as blocks settle and talus rearranges. Maintenance becomes a negotiation with processes that do not read schedules. You can rebuild a wall, but you cannot rebuild gravity. Now, as you near the rim, you have another reveal waiting. Even if the canyon feels ancient and final, it is still adjusting to the same controls. The plateau can continue to rise. Base level far downstream can continue to shift. Climate can swing again, and it will, because it always does. And the river will respond, because it has no other hobby. So, the canyon is not a completed sculpture. It is a snapshot of a moving system. You stand again at a rimside angle, looking down, and you see more than depth. You see a drainage network still working, tributaries still trying to catch up to the main stem, still cutting their own steps upstream, debris fans still being built and eaten back, rockfalls still punctuating the walls with fresh, pale scars. You even see the way light reveals texture, alcoves and terraces and benches. Those are not decorations. They are the geometry of ongoing adjustment. Now you let time move forward, because the outline of this story demands consequence. What happens next? When a canyon like this keeps being a canyon, it does not simply deepen forever at one rate, because constraints appear. Harder rock slows incision in some reaches, forcing energy into rapids and plunge pools. Debris can choke segments, temporarily raising local base level until cleared. Dams alter sediment supply and flood regime, changing where the river can do work. And the river's own profile can approach a temporary equilibrium, where incision roughly balances uplift. Equilibrium is a dangerous word here, because it sounds peaceful. It really means a temporary truce between opposing forces. A truce that lasts until one side changes terms. If uplift increases, incision must increase, or the river steepens again. If base level drops further downstream, incision must chase it again. If climate shifts to produce bigger floods, the river gets new opportunities. If climate shifts to reduce runoff, incision slows and hill slopes may dominate widening. So the canyon's future is not one line. It is a branching set of possible adjustments. And some of those adjustments are already visible in the modern channel. Sandbars reduced, vegetation encroaching, banks changing, rapids shaped by boulder constrictions, many formed from rockfalls. Each rapid is a local nick zone, a place where energy focuses and the river tries to chew. Some rapids persist because new debris keeps arriving. Some get rearranged by big flows, natural or managed. The river is constantly re-editing its own staircase. Now, because you are still you want to know if this place will always look like this. The canyon answers with the only honest response: probably not. Given enough time, the canyon can widen dramatically as cliffs retreat. Temples and buttes can collapse, turning into piles, then into slopes. Side canyons can merge, turning isolated amphitheaters into broader basins. The river can shift within its corridor, cutting new inner channels. Terraces can be abandoned and then carved again, depending on future pulses. And on very long timescales, tectonics can rearrange the entire drainage again. Rivers get captured. Divides migrate. Basins open and close. The Colorado exists as a solution to a specific set of boundary conditions. Change the conditions, and the solution changes. Now you take a step back from the rim and let the pines frame your view. The wind is colder here, and it brings the smell of sap and dry needles. The canyon below looks calm, because distance makes everything look calm. You know better now, which is not always a comfort. You know the river is still moving sediment, even when you cannot see it. You know slopes are still creeping, even when they look still. You know freeze-thaw is still prying at cracks up here on the rim in winter. You know monsoon bursts still hit the side canyons in summer, delivering debris like overdue packages. And you know the plateau itself is not a static stage. It is a slow-moving platform. This is what it means to stand on a restless planet. Not that the ground shakes constantly, but that the ground is always mid-change. Now you make one more decision because you need evidence that this is ongoing. You decide to look for the newest scars, the freshest failures, the places where the canyon admits it is not finished. You scan the walls for pale streaks, and you find them quickly. A bright talus cone below a cliff, angular blocks that have not yet darkened. A dust fan on a ledge where a small slide ran recently. A fresh crack near the edge of a rim trail, thin but sharp. None of these are dramatic alone. Together, they are a chorus. They tell you the canyon is still widening, still shedding, still exporting. Now you think about the river's incision again, because it is tempting to assume it is done cutting. But incision does not require a dramatic visible drop every year. It can be a millimeter here, a centimeter there, during rare floods. It can be localized plucking in a jointed reach, followed by years of transport. It can be the deepening of a single pool that later becomes a step in the profile. You do not watch it happen like a time lapse, you infer it from the system's behavior. From terraces, from nick zones, from the distribution of rapids and bedrock exposures, from the way tributaries are still hanging and adjusting, and from the simple fact that the river still wants a lower finish line than the bed it currently has. Now you let your mind travel far downstream again, because base level remains the leash. Sea level changes with glacial cycles, rising and falling, shifting the effective outlet elevation. Tectonics in the lower basin region can keep changing valley floors. Sediment delivery to the Gulf of California region builds deltas, which can raise local base level temporarily. Then channels avulse, or the delta progrades, or subsidence creates new accommodation space. The outlet is not fixed. It is a moving target. And every time it moves, the river must renegotiate its profile. That renegotiation is written into the canyon as new terraces and renewed incision phases. So even without a dramatic new canyon, the existing canyon keeps being modified. Now you notice how the canyon's width varies with rock type, and it gives you another practical concept.